Okay, so in this video we're going to take a look at observational designs, and there are, I think, 5 observational designs that we're going to look at. The first one is going to be prospective cohort study, and this is going to be a rather short video. Really not much to go into for observational designs. And in the prospective cohort study, so prospective cohort study, we're just going to term it like that. In a prospective cohort study, let me just check out the brush size. Let me just change the brush size. Okay, so in a prospective cohort study, the only real difference we have from that in an RCT is that the people who are receiving the treatment were not assigned to it randomly. So we basically have the sample of patients here. Somehow some of the sample of patients got the treatment, and we're going to follow a group of people who didn't have the treatment but were similar in certain characteristics. So we're going to call these people our control group, and we're going to follow them throughout time to see whether or not they developed some sort of outcome. Right? So again, no real difference between this and a randomized control trial, other than the fact that there was no randomization that occurred. Right? The research question was still asked was still asked before we calculated, or before we before we went ahead and gathered any data. But the people that we collected perhaps received the treatment because they were somehow different from because of certain prognostic factors potentially, right? So because of the lack of randomization in a prospective cohort study and a lack of allocation concealment, there's a risk of selection bias, as opposed to potentially RCTs when we try to reduce that selection bias by performing that allocation concealment and having that random sequence generation going on, right? So when we look at prospective cohort studies, we want to look for evidence that the reason for selection into the treatment group and the control group wasn't because of something, and if it was because of certain prognostic factors, then maybe try to balance this out. Probably not possible, not impossible, but maybe try to look for those reasons. But remember that just because there is the potential for selection bias doesn't mean that the bias was there. It's just at a greater risk for potential selection bias. So that's a prospective cohort study. We could have on the same hierarchy, so we're going to be going down that hierarchy of evidence for observational studies. We could have a prospective cohort study with a historical control. So this is now a little bit further below. So essentially what happens is that we have a sample, right? And these people went through the treatment and we followed them for the outcome, right? And we asked the research question again before we collected any of this data. Again, there was no randomization that occurred at all. But because we have a historical control, what this is saying is that at the time of asking the question, we already had the outcome for a sample of patients who were in the control group. Okay? We already had the outcome for the sample of patients who were in the control group. So here now, not only are we worried about selection bias because there's no randomization, there's no allocation concealment or anything like that, and the fact that we're following one group retrospectively and one group prospectively puts us at a risk for some other things also. So first of all, we're stuck with a lot of the characteristics for this. For us to follow this, we have to follow perhaps similar protocols that we got from our retrospective data. We can't change anything from this because it's all looking back. We're looking at perhaps charts and charted history, something that's happened in the past, so we can't change it. So maybe we'll have to go through similar protocols in order to see this. So we're concerned about similar protocols, were there similar co-interventions, and were they even looking for a similar outcome, or was one of these outcomes just happened to be something that they found, right? So that's some of the considerations that we need to make when we look at a prospective cohort study with historical controls. Of course, all of the other biases that we looked at relevant to the RCTs are also relevant here for prospective cohort studies, prospective cohort studies with historical controls, and so on and so forth. Now, we could have a completely retrospective cohort study. Let's erase this and look at what that means for us. A completely retrospective cohort study means that we had a sample of people, and some of them had a treatment, some of them had the control, and they were followed for the outcome. But the research question, right? Gosh, this should be an O because the R represents randomization. There was no randomization. But the outcome came after, sorry, not the outcome. The research question came after all of the data was collected. So again, we're worried about selection bias. Was there any sort of matching that happened? Yeah, and was the reason why people went into the treatment group because of certain prognostic factors. Now, since we're looking at charting, right? We're looking at charting for the treatment group, then we're also looking at charting for the control group, right? And we're looking at historical charts to see the patient data. We're worried about not only was there similar protocols and similar outcomes, but we're also worried about, was the measurement of the treatment present or absent? Was that standardized across all of the patients, right? It's unlikely that clinicians who are writing down information, that different clinicians did everything in the exact same way. So we're worried about that whole standardization thing, right? And we're then worried about, was it standardized when people were looking for the measurement of outcome in this group and the measurement of the outcomes in this group, right? So, something that's important to consider here is, was there accurate charting methods or standardized charting methods? So we've essentially lost all control of our ability to actually go on and perform the tests ourselves in a retrospective cohort study. The next study we're going to take a look at is a case control study. Case control study. And the main difference here is that in all of the previous studies that we were looking at, in the prospective cohort study, in the prospective cohort study with historical control, and in the retrospective cohort study, we were grouping people based on the treatment, right? We took a sample of people, we divided them based on their treatment, and then we followed them to see if they had the outcome. In a case control study, what we're doing is we're going a little backwards. So we have a sample of patients, and we're going to take a look at whether or not they had the outcome. So we're going to group them based on whether or not they had the disease, so they were outcome positive, or whether they didn't have the disease, whether they were a control, right? So they were outcome negative. And then we're going to follow them back and see if they had the exposure to the treatment, right? Did they have that exposure to the treatment? Did they have that exposure to the treatment? So a research question was still asked. It was asked after, basically, right? A research question was asked after we collected anything, right? So what we're going to take a look at, right, is what are some of the features of the case control study that puts it further down on that hierarchy, and one of that is that basically we asked the research question after all the data was collected, right? But so in addition to that whole thing about not being randomized, there was no selection bias, we're worried about similar protocols, similar outcomes, whether or not there was accurate standardized charting like we talked about in the retrospective cohort study. We're also now worried about not being able to comment on incidents, right? Because of the fact that we're looking at people who have the outcomes and we're grouping based on outcomes, we're not able to comment on the risk of disease. Or at best, what we can do is actually comment on the odds ratio, the odds of getting the disease, right? And the odds ratio is really only a good estimate of the risk ratio, right? If the event rate in the control group is greater than 10%, right? So odds ratio, we'll say, is a good estimate of the risk ratio if the event rate in the control group is greater than 10%. Okay? Otherwise, the disease is too rare, and the odds ratio is not a good estimate of the risk ratio. But the problem for case control studies is that it's not able to comment on that risk ratio. It's not able to comment on risk. There's an unknown incidence. We don't know when the disease came about and whether or not it was due to the exposure. We don't know if the exposure came first or if it came after, right? So the best we can do is report an odds ratio. We just have to take into consideration that the odds ratio is really only a good estimate of the risk ratio when this is true. Okay? So something we can do to reduce selection bias in case control studies is by taking people through matching. So we can match potential prognostic factors between two groups, and we can then eliminate or control for that influence of those prognostic factors, right? There are also other ways that we can do matching. For example, group matching, right? Let's say we had people who smoke and people who don't smoke. There are 20 people who smoke in the outcome group and 20% of people who smoke who are smokers in the outcome negative group, right? Basically, we want that to be the proportion to be balanced, right? Of smokers and non-smokers in the outcome and non-outcome group. We can also do individual matching. So, for example, we can do male to male, or we can do one-to-many matching, which is going to help us increase our power. So, for example, we can add one male case for every 4 male controls, or one male case for every 4 male, one female case for every 4 female controls, and so on and so forth, right? Now, a question that comes up very often is, how do I go about selecting cases for my case control study? What constitutes a good case, right? A good outcome positive. So you want to make sure that the people that you choose are both really that they're both in a similar stage of disease, right? Similar stage of disease, and that they're as incident as possible. So they're as close to the earliest time that they could have possibly got the disease as possible. And the reason for that is because, so we'll just add that here, we want to make sure that they're similar cases and that they're incident. And we'll talk about this in a bit. But the reason why we want incident cases, and basically incident cases are cases that were diagnosed early, right? It refers to at the time of diagnosis. And people in a similar stage of disease, we don't want prevalent cases. So the reason why we want incident cases rather than prevalent cases is because prevalent cases that have been known to have a disease for a long period of time, may actually start to underrepresent those people who die quickly or who are cured quickly, right? So that's why we want cases that are diagnosed as close to the onset of disease as possible. So we want to choose cases that have similar stages of diseases, are in a similar stage of disease, but we also want to make sure that we're choosing cases who are not only at an early stage of the disease potentially, but also that their diagnosis was done close to the onset of the disease, so that we can potentially discern what actually happened after what factors influenced, or what factors were present before the disease and what factors were present after the disease. So that's some of the things that we want to take into consideration when we're choosing a case in a case control study. For those who are controls, we want to make sure that we're choosing controls from the exact same population. So if our controls were to have the disease, then they would have been included in the disease group. We want to choose those people, except the fact that they don't have the disease, so they're going to become our controls. Right? So we're going to randomly sample from the exact same population, from the exact same medical institution or similar setting, exact same institution or a similar institution from where we got our cases from, in order to make sure that we're not having any sort of bias introduced here. Now, let's say that this control was a person who never had a chance of even receiving the treatment, right? Like, for example, if we're testing some sort of prostate cancer thing, we can't include females in the study because females cannot receive prostate cancer, or females can't have prostate cancer, right? So the idea is that if a person had no chance of ever receiving the treatment, they cannot be in our control group. Now, let's say a control has a different condition for which it's appropriate to administer the same treatment. So what's going to happen is that this person is going to receive the treatment as a control group, but they're going to appear to have improved because of the fact that they had another disease for which that treatment would have helped them. Well, what's going to happen is that our control group now is going to be overestimated with treated people, with people who have healed. So now our odds ratio, which we use to report in our case control study, is going to be our odds ratio for the outcome positive is going to be underestimated, because now that person has been shown to heal in the outcome negative group, when in fact that person shouldn't have been included in the study. Now let's say that this person or another control comes about, and that person just simply cannot receive the treatment because it might interfere with a current treatment that they're receiving. Well, then the control group becomes underrepresented with treated persons, and then that odds ratio for our outcome positive becomes overestimated, right? We basically included a person that shouldn't have been included in here, right? They should be eligible to receive the treatment. In both cases that I just talked about, they shouldn't have been eligible to receive the treatment because, number one, it would have healed the person who didn't have the outcome of interest but had something else, and number two, they just weren't able to get the treatment themselves. So in the first case, we underestimated our odds ratio. In this case, we've overestimated our odds ratio. And now finally, that brings us to our final type of observational study. And that observational study is known as the case series. A case series are probably the simplest type of observational study. All we do is we gather a sample of people, we give them the treatment, and then we follow them out for the outcome. We follow them for the outcome. Right? So as you can see, we don't have a control group in here. And what happens is that for a case series, it's really just a hypothesis generator, right? It's a proof of concept sort of thing. It's basically going to tell us whether our treatment is working or not. So we can make some conclusions here. If our treatment is working, then we can move it on to the next phase because it could be that the treatment is possibly working. If our treatment isn't working and is showing negative results, so people are getting harmed by it, then we don't take it on to the next phase because it's probably harming patients. If we see no change, then we can't say that the treatment wasn't working, right? Maybe that treatment stopped the progression of whatever it was we were looking for, stopped the progression of the disease, for example. So we still might want to take it on to the next phase, right? So that's the whole idea of case series. It's a hypothesis generator. It's that whole proof of concept study. Okay, so that was our case series. Now, because these are observational designs, I'm trying to make claims of causation, right? I want to know whether or not my treatment actually is somehow correlated with the outcome that I'm seeing, right? So I need to first prove a couple of things. First, I need there to be a strong association. So my strength of association is very important. That's something I want to show. The second thing I want to show is if there's consistency, right? Studies that have been shown by multiple studies and the results have been validated by multiple studies, well, that's consistency. If I can show that multiple studies can validate my results and can replicate my results, then I have good consistency. The third thing I want to show is, especially from prospective studies, is that did the disease happen after the exposure? So did the exposure lead to the disease? If I can show this, then I have stronger evidence for causation, right? The fourth thing I might want to show is a dose response. Whoops, ignore that. Dose response. If I can show that giving more treatment shows that I can get more effect, then again, I have more evidence for causation. I'm more convinced that there's some sort of causation. And finally, does it make sense from several different perspectives, right? From a biological perspective, from an analogical perspective, from an epidemiological perspective. Does it make sense from other perspectives that one thing, that my treatment should cause the outcome that I'm seeing? And that's essentially it for observational designs. The next study design that we're going to take a look at are prognostic study designs. Hope that helps.